Hey everybody, Todd Mitchell here. Welcome back to Game Dev Breakdown. This time we're talking to Clinton Keith, the author of Agile Game Development, Build, Play, Repeat, 2nd edition. He has been around the game industry for quite a while, and he's done some very cool stuff that I know you're going to enjoy hearing about. We'll get to find out what's in the book, what he's presenting at GDC coming up, and just some general industry shop talk. So hang out, enjoy, and here is my chat with Clinton.
Good evening, fans. Tim Kitzrow here, the voice of NBA Jam, and you're listening to the Game Dev Breakdown Podcast, brought to you by CodeWritePlay.com. Whoa, boom shakalaka.
My mom gave birth in 1985. I was bluer than a Pac-Man ghost, barely alive. In the Cold War, my only blanket was Tetris. I played Rampart with Reagan, rampaged the world for breakfast. The laundromat was my sanctuary, the arcade was my church.
Clinton Keith, author of Agile Game Development, Build, Play, Repeat, 2nd edition. How are you?
I'm doing great, Todd. How about yourself?
Just great. I have enjoyed looking through the book so far. I'm still working on it because that is a big book full of a lot of great stuff. How are people enjoying it so far?
Well, I haven't even gotten my copies yet, and I've heard from a couple people that received theirs, and like you said, it's about 500 pages, so right. I don't think anyone's had the time to go through it yet.
So, I've gotten to start, and I'm enjoying some of the anecdotes and hearing about your time in the industry. For listeners not yet familiar, give us sort of the highlights of your game industry career and sort of some of the projects and teams you've been attached to.
Sure. Well, I came from the defense contracting industry, and worked on some pretty huge projects like F-22, fighter aircraft, F-23 or YF-23. And so I was kind of used to huge projects with large documents and the failures that went along with that. Like planes like the F-35, which I touched on a little bit in its early development. Hundreds of billions of dollars over budget and a decade late. And so when I shifted to the game industry, I found that we were making very small games that took 6 months and maybe a dozen people to finish it. My first game out the door was a driving game called Midtown Madness. Went on to do a number of other driving games, worked on early versions of what's now Red Dead Redemption. And over the course of a decade, I saw the size of games increase. So instead of a dozen people for 6 months, my last game I worked on, which was based on the Bourne movies, Jason Bourne movies, we got up to about 150 people, and it took about 3 years. And since then, I've worked on projects where there's up to 1,000 developers. And a lot of these practices that you see, because it gets very expensive, started to look like the projects I saw in the defense industry with big, huge budgets, big, huge plans, large documents that never quite worked out. And you're starting to see the problems with, or you've been seeing the problems with games going over budget or releasing very late or just not being very good at all because the document couldn't predict exactly what was going to be fun with the game. But I had this experience early on in my game development career where I met this man named Shigeru Miyamoto, who is probably the most famous game developer who has done Mario and Donkey Kong and all these favorite games. He's probably the most successful game developer. And he ran projects differently. He didn't even kind of run projects. He just ran games differently, where he would talk about an idea with a very small team, and he'd give us 3 months of money and tell us to go find the fun. And he'd come back in 3 months. That was the only limit of the size of the contract. And if we hadn't found the fun, well, we try a different idea. And we kept going through all sorts of different ideas, and finally settled on one. Then when we had found the fun, he gave us more money and more time to finish the game up, which is the complete opposite of that pre-planned approach.
Yeah.
So when I started a company called High Moon Studios, which grew very fast, ran into these traditional problems. About this time, when we were really struggling, this book about Scrum came out in 2003. And I read it, and it reminded me of that find the fun approach of exploring what's fun, discovering what's fun, and instead of trying to plan it out in a big, huge 300-page document that nobody really reads anyways. And so we applied that. It's like, hey, let's take 2 weeks instead of 3 months and see if we can make the game better, see if we can find a little bit more fun, throw out a bunch of stuff, fail fast, and build upon that. And once we get the core of the game, then do that approach where now we can plan more. Now we can plan to build the 20 hours of gameplay and set up more of kind of an assembly line of making all the characters and the levels and things like that to get the game out the door. And so we practiced that. I started talking about that at the Game Developer Conference. And then in 2008, decided to do this full time, going around to studios. And I visit about 10 to 20 studios a year for the last dozen years. And learned a lot. Learned about, how different teams develop games differently. And also over the last dozen years, you've seen mobile emerge as a huge force. There's a big, dominant section of video game development. And all the lessons learned in how Agile practices apply even more to mobile game development kind of led to the second edition of the book, which is just coming out now.
Yeah, so I mean, you've kind of been an expert on this development strategy for a long time, and it's interesting to see new things come into the industry and how they kind of stand up with what you do. I'd say probably not too many people have such an interesting look into the state of the game industry as yourself. Is that right?
Yeah, I worked at 2 studios, and each one for about 8 years. And you get very used to this one approach, this one view of development. And it was quite a shift to go and visit, up to 20 studios a year and spend up to like a week with each one or a month or so, and kind of get this different perspective. It's very interesting, and we actually threw a book together to kind of collect all those different practices as well.
Yeah.
And just learn, and I try to incorporate that, as you mentioned. I try to tell a lot of stories in the books about, about things in ways that kind of connect in real terms and real stories about what game developers go through. Because there's just some amazing stories about what's going on around the world in game development.
Absolutely. And the book kind of opens with this. There's a chapter called The Crisis Facing Game Development. And in that chapter, you don't really pull any punches about some of the issues that have sort of, I would maybe call them growing pains in the industry. It started with small teams and small projects, like you said, and a lot of the fun is gone because we have these very large projects with monumental pressure. I mean, we've got crunch culture, things you hear about in the news all the time. And it seems to me that this book is sort of a playbook for, if not eliminating all of the cultural issues, certainly finding a way that it would at least be possible to avoid things like, out of control crunch or greatly missed budgets, tons of lost money. Is that right?
Right. And much of the edition of the second edition is talking about, what I've discovered over the last 12 years, which a lot of it just really comes down to culture as well as project management practices. I've worked with a lot of teams that, have to ship at a fixed date, like sports games. They have to come out at before the next season comes out, or they lose half their sales. Mm-hmm. And really just this approach of saying, we have to get every bit of scope that we planned into the game and make sure it hits this specific date, just kind of leads to those issues where they're building all of these features in parallel, and they get themselves painted into a corner where the only way out from their point of view is that we have to make people work here 7 days a week, Yeah. And one of the things that I introduce in others, and this comes from, our coaches in the past and writings for non-game developers, is that there's ways of measuring your progress. It's kind of like, exploring how are we finding the fun by working on the most important things, a few at a time, to discover what the game is early, than basically shoving all this scope in and crossing our fingers to hope that the game is going to come together at the end.
Right.
And that second approach leads to Scrum because it's panic. And one of the things that we talk about is measuring different ways. And, a lot of companies still, they measure productivity by counting the cars in the parking lot on Saturday, or measuring how many hours people are working on tasks, rather than measuring what's going into the game, which is harder to do, but it tells you more of a real story that once you get about 2 or 3 weeks into crunch, your actual productivity of improving the game declines. It actually declines several weeks after that, to the point where you're adding less to the game than you would if it was a normal 5-day work week. Mm-hmm. We discovered that one early, and at that point we just said, hey, we're never going to force crunch. In fact, the problem became is keeping teams away from crunching themselves. Beyond that 2 or 3 week period of time, that turns out, it's studies have shown that since from a century ago. So it's nothing new, but it just comes to the fact that it's really a cultural issue, where we just think that we could treat people like machines, put them in at their desk for twice as much time, that will get twice as much output from them. And that certainly isn't the case.
Yeah, and you mentioned GDC before, and that'll come up again here shortly, but I think it was one of their own surveys that went out probably 2 years ago now that came back with like as much as 40-45% of people who said they had crunched in the last year said, no one told me to do this. I just felt the pressure, and I knew I had so much, to do that I felt I couldn't do anything else. So it definitely seems like that's correct, that it takes someone in your position with your expertise to sort of avoid. I mean, is it improper planning or budgeting, or are you just tackling too much at once, like you said?
Well, it's the fact that we really can't plan as much as we really want to. When you're spending $100 million, there's stakeholders out there, there's publishers out there that really want to know exactly what they're going to get for $100 million. And that forces us to make these incredible plans that, nobody has any idea about how much we can accomplish. And a lot of it is risky in terms of, like I said, finding the fun. Mm-hmm. And so what happens is because we have this big, huge plan. And again, I saw this in the defense industry when I worked on a document that weighed 40 pounds. And the Air Force approved our plan, which was put together by me, a person that was just out of college. I just gathered all these documents together into one big document. I didn't even read it. I know the Air Force didn't read it. They just weighed it. And they felt it's like, hey, TRW Military Avionics has a 40-pound plan, where Grumman only has a 20-pound plan. Let's sign TRW. And that's what's really going on, is that there's this fake sense of certainty that puts the blinders on us, that we just start making these little parts of a game. And then we assemble all those parts at the end, and then we find out whether it's fun at the end when we run out of time and money. And the only recourse to managers that don't know any better or are afraid of losing their jobs is to force the team into crunch, which I'm fully guilty of. For the first 10 years of my career as a game project manager or director of product development, I put teams into crunch. I didn't know any better. I didn't have any better metrics. Yeah. And when somebody's investing $100 million, you just can't turn around and say, well, we're just going to explore. We're going to discover something. And so the different approach, again, it's cultural, is to get those stakeholders, those publishers, more intimately involved with what's going on every few weeks, to say, hey, this is the latest. Let's discuss where we should go next to make the game more fun. We still have this vision of doing, like a sports game. We're not going to change the vision every 2 weeks, but we're going to refine and understand a little bit more. And again, this is a lesson I learned from the most popular and successful video game developer in the history of our industry, of, find the fun, which is focusing on risk. What's the riskiest part of this $100 million effort? Well, if it's not fun, we're not going to make our money back. And so that's a lot of my GDC talk is how do we embrace risk? How do we, instead of avoiding it or trying to write a big, huge document that makes people feel better that it's somehow planned away, which you can't plan away uncertainty, how are we going to tackle it head on and do something about it up front? instead of trying to plan it away. And talking about that, really approaching it from a cultural point of view. From leadership, what's leadership doing? How are they encouraging that? How are they, accepting that, hey, we're going to do a bunch of experiments and many of them are going to fail. And we can't punish people for not, for trying something and discovering whether it's fun or not.
Right. And you talk about the importance of changing the way that you plan, the way you design, the way you document. Having come from an Air Force contracting background too, oddly enough, I've also been caught up in some of the super planning and super budgeting and the things that sort of fall through the cracks in that situation long term. But I don't want to leave anybody behind who isn't familiar with these concepts. So at very high level, talk for a moment about what it looks like to be in an agile environment compared to what a lot of other, not just game development studios, but enterprise software across that industry. What does that look like by comparison?
Well, a lot of times, you look at it from the different levels. From the developer point of view, typically in a more traditional approach, you're handed a spreadsheet or a Jira tool that lists the individual tasks that you have to accomplish. Mm-hmm. Write this bit of code and write that function in there, and you really have no idea about how that integrates with the whole, or expect to see that really working with the whole for quite a whole product for quite some time. From the developer's point of view, from an agile approach, is that you're part of a cross-discipline team, and usually no more than 10 people. And what you're doing is you're given a challenge or a feature from the user's perspective every 2 or 3 weeks, or you discuss that. Discuss it with this role called a product owner, somebody who's the ultimate vision holder for the entire product. And you discuss. It's like, hey, what can we accomplish in 2 weeks, and why do we want to do this? What's, from the customer or player's point of view, why is this important? Mm-hmm. And you have this conversation about how we could possibly solve this. And you and this cross-functional team will come up with a plan that you guys own yourselves about how you feel you can accomplish this goal to add value to this product in the next few weeks. And then you're off and doing that, and you own that plan as a team, and you can come up with modifications, not necessarily to the goal, but how you achieve that goal, and have discussions with the stakeholders along the way if something pops up. And then at the end of the 2 weeks, you demonstrate the product with that improved functionality that you agreed to. And usually there's more than one feature that you're adding or improving the game. And sometimes you won't achieve all of them. Yeah. Because there is uncertainty, there is exploration and trying things out. And then we get back together with the stakeholders every 2 or 3 weeks, and we discuss, all right, did that add value? Do we want to double down on that? Do we want to go in a different direction? Again, it's kind of Miyamoto's Find the Fun. And, over the course of development, you're kind of narrowing in on things. And I talk about this at GDC where, when we start a game project, we're in full exploration. We're throwing stuff out. We're experimenting like scientific researchers and trying different things. Right? Favorite example is SpaceX. It's just like they decided, hey, we want to land the first stage of our rocket. And they didn't spend a decade trying to come up with the perfect solution. They said, all right, let's launch one in 3 months and see what happens when we try to land it. And of course it blew up, but they learned a lot from it. And the next experiment they did 3 months later still blew up, but it took them less than a year to kind of nail that landing, or a couple of years to nail that landing, where it's just like if you try to come up with a perfect plan, it would take you a decade and you still probably would crash on the first one. And so that first part is just exploring, throwing a lot of things out. And then as you go forward in the project, you're refining things and you're narrowing things down, and you're exploiting what the game's opportunities are, and especially with, as I've mentioned, with live mobile games that are very predominant. You can get that feedback from your players. You can get that data back that tells you on a day-to-day basis what parts they're enjoying and what parts they're struggling with, and you can come up with that plan to release something in 2 weeks that doubles down on the things that they're enjoying, or fixes the things that are getting in their way, instead of, again, adhering to that plan. Now, from a project manager's point of view, again, from a traditional point of view, or a traditional approach, like in the defense industry or my early days as a game project manager, I'd come up with, these huge spreadsheets that would list out those tasks. I'd come out with the perfect plan. And it would take me 3 months to create that plan. And it's kind of like what Eisenhower said, about D-Day. He said, the plan is, the planning is essential, but the plan is useless. Because, the paratroopers dropped on the wrong part of France. Omaha Beach was a disaster. And basically, it's like I couldn't spend another 3 months revising the plan that I'd worked on after the first week of development. And so the idea is we plan the short term in detail. And then the further out the plan goes, the plan gets less defined. It starts talking about larger chunks of things that we're going to break down later, because the idea is we can make better plans when we learn more. And so the idea of agile planning is to defer decisions as far as you can responsibly defer them until you can make better decisions. Because when you make all the decisions, your design decisions, your technology decisions at the start of the project's development, you're making all those decisions when you have the least amount of information.
Yeah.
And so there has to be this level of vagueness. And the problem is with these, the stakeholders or the publishers that can't accept that level of vagueness. But the thing is that we have to, again, it's a cultural thing. We have to say, all right, in exchange for this level of vagueness, we need you more involved to come and look at the build and look at the game every 2 or 3 weeks and have conversations with us. And it really comes down to building that level of trust between the developer and the stakeholders, and build that higher level of communication, because those two kind of go hand in hand. And when you can accomplish that, you get better results, again, because it's like I worked like on my first game, Midtown Madness. It's our publisher, Microsoft, kind of ignored us for the first 90% of development. And then marketing came in at the end, with all these tremendous ideas. We called them the Eye of Sauron, because it was just this big focus, this eyeball of marketing turned on us and focused on us when it was just too late to make changes. And they came up with great ideas.
Yeah.
They wanted to put Taco Bells all over our game so that they could give away free burritos. And I was like, man, that's a fantastic idea, giving free burritos away. But it could have been the best feature in video game history, but we just had no more time. We had to get it out the door.
That's some fun trivia about Midtown Madness. That's a good, nice takeaway there.
Yeah.
So, no plan survives contact with the enemy. So that makes a lot of sense. Tell me, I know at this point in your career, you've gotten to see and help implement this process yourself with different development teams. And it's a smart strategy, but I'm sure a lot of people look at it as somewhat radical. I mean, do you get pushback on things like cross-discipline teams that weren't used to working that way? From all levels, from creative and from management?
Well, especially at first, back I started talking about this in 2005 at GDC, that was, well, this will never work for games. But many of them had been doing things like pods and things like that, where they understood cross-discipline teams, and Miyamoto worked with other developers as well. Then it became a little bit more focused. It's like people would say, it's like, well, this won't work with MMOs, or this won't work with our particular game. And to me, it's just like there's no one size fits all. It's like at first I was teaching a lot of Scrum, but Scrum is great for exploration, for what we call the pre-production. It's not so great for the assembly line, the production line of creating assets and like levels and characters and things like that. And so I kind of mix up these tools, and what works for an MMO game might not work for a free-to-play mobile game. And we change up practices, and it's all about exploration and giving the team the ability to, within those iterations, the 2 to 3 week iterations, to basically come up with ways of doing their work better, because people who are closest to the work will come up with some of the best ideas. So I think some of it, it's really mainstream right now. I would say practices like Scrum and Kanban are really the dominant ones in the game industry. But a lot of what people call Scrum or call Kanban is really, it really doesn't follow a lot of the principles in many ways, because some of the radical parts, or parts that people call radical, are things like letting the teams organize their own membership.
There's never been a better time to find out why BetMGM is the king of sportsbooks. Download the BetMGM app and place a $10 moneyline wager on any NBA playoff game. If either team hits a three-pointer in the game, you'll win $200 in free bets. Just use code CHAMPION200 when you make your first bet. Sign up now and discover BetMGM's daily promotions, boosted odds specials, and more. Download the app or go to BetMGM.com and use code CHAMPION200 to win $200 in free bets if either team hits a three in any NBA playoff game. Visit BetMGM.com for terms and conditions. 21 years of age or older to wager. Virginia only. New customer offer. All promotions are subject to qualification and eligibility requirements. Rewards issued as non-withdrawable free bets or site credit. Free bets expire 7 days from issuance. Please gamble responsibly. Gambling problem? Call 1-888-532-3500.
Or basically just giving the teams more responsibility over their day to day, and then flattening out the organization. Because some of the most successful game studios are ones that are more self-organizing, where like Supercell or Valve. But those are kind of exceptions. Those are ones that have to basically start from scratch to be entirely self-organizing. And then you go into larger studios or larger companies that have hierarchies, where you have middle managers whose entire job is to assign work to individuals, where there's a lot of challenge with saying, it's like, hey, let's give them more control. Let's treat them like adult professionals.
Yeah.
And let's agree on what a goal is, and let them figure out as a team how to get there. And they'll do a better job. I mean, that's just absolutely provable, and it's one of those things that happens overnight almost, where you give a cross-discipline group a challenge. It's like, hey, let's make jumping fun in the game, and you figure out how to achieve it, and we'll see you in 2 or 3 weeks. We'll give you support and advice and feedback wherever you need it. But the thing is that when the most powerful factor in game development or any development is the cohesion of the team. This is the same in the military as well, is that team cohesion and chemistry has such spectacular impacts on productivity. And this is another lesson I learned. It's a story I tell in the book, where we were working on Midtown Madness, which is a very successful game. Mm-hmm. But at first, Microsoft wanted it to be a traffic simulator, where you could actually get stuck in traffic jams. And so we developed it, and we were like, oh, we don't really believe in this game, but they left us alone. And we started doing things like putting in extra wide sidewalks that, hey, you could actually drive on. And started adding a little bit of this over-the-top madness, like we put in a big, huge shopping mall with a bunch of things that could be destroyed, like the Blues Brothers movie. And we just kept adding these things, and then finally, when that storm turned on us, it's like, hey, this isn't the game we paid for. And we kept adding things, and we were working. I'd be brushing my teeth and come up with ideas like this cops and robbers mode, kind of capture the flag in a racing game. And but we were a team. None of us had ever worked on a video game before, and it was our first video game, and it was just a pleasure to work on, and it was one of the more successful games I've ever worked on. If you could find ways of building that team cohesion and the right chemistry, people just don't want to let down the people they work with on a day-to-day basis, and they'll talk together, and they'll work together, they'll solve problems that they see on a day-to-day basis, and they'll come up with some fantastic ideas or solutions that, as a manager, I was just blown away by it. I'd come in the morning, and a programmer and an artist decided to work overnight on this this awesome feature. And they showed it to me, and I was just like, I can't believe you were able to do that. It's just like it would be one of the best features in the game.
Yeah.
So just opening up, giving people creativity is a huge benefit.
Yeah, Midtown Madness is such a testament to empowering team members because even some of the folks I've talked to who like, hey, do you remember this game? This just came up the other day, and somebody will say, no, I don't really remember that, but it sort of set the tone for like Driver that came out right after it, some of the aspects of the Grand Theft Auto games and stuff. People really love that style of gameplay, and sort of the fact that iterations based on fun ideas from the creative levels is really a powerful statement about how valuable that is, because once a conversation starts about that game still seems to have a lot of fans, and the games that came right after have a lot of fans as well. So that's pretty impressive.
Yeah, it's shocking. I mean, it's just 20 years later, and I went into a Discord conversation with Midtown Madness fans, and it was crazy. And it was really the reason why Rockstar bought us, and the Hausers were huge fans of Midtown Madness, and we happened to run into them at E3, and we did Midnight Club with them and Smuggler's Run, which was kind of a little bit over the top, but it was the same thing with those teams. I mean, I remember this story from Smuggler's Run where there's a programmer that threw in. The designer wanted animals running around. Smuggler's Run was kind of an outdoor racing game where you're smuggling something from Mexico. Typical Rockstar game. And so he decided to just throw in deer running around in the game. And so one of the things I used to do is I used to bring home these test kits, these test consoles. This was a PlayStation 2 launch game, and have my sons play it. And they were like 3 and 6 years old at the time. And at one time, so I brought it home after he put the deer in, and there's random individual deer running around the forest. It was just supposed to be just a prop. And my sons had completely abandoned the racing element and were just hunting deer down to just hit deer. And the deer would have perfect elasticity, and they would just fly off, ragdolling. And they were laughing their butts off. And it turned out, that turned out to be the most fun feature in the game. All the reviewers were just like saying, yeah, racing is fun, but you can actually go after deer. And so again, it was just like these little things that the developers would come up with and think of and throw in. It took them like 4 hours to put it in there.
Yeah.
It just turned out to just like, be part of a hit game that people loved, that you couldn't, that would never got into a design document.
Oh, yeah. You clearly have a knack for being in the right place at the right time from reading about and hearing about your career. And I have to heap some praise for a moment on Midnight Club. I actually played Midnight Club the night before my wedding 8 years ago. It's funny and kind of random, but we were at the hotel. I had my own room to sort of get ready and all that the night before, and I had brought some of my computer stuff with me and everything, and I had some games, and I thumbed through there. I'm like, I have not played this game nearly enough, and I had a lovely time. Totally put me in a great headspace for what came the following day.
Yeah, I had a similar story I shared in the book where I was playing Mech Warrior 3. So I contacted the developers of Mech Warrior 3, and that was another amazing story where the developers on their own pulled a rabbit out of their hat. And Mech Warrior 3 was a very, very popular game that was canceled, and they saved it over a weekend.
Oh, the Midnight redesign, yeah.
Yeah. So I tell that full story in the book. I tracked those guys down on LinkedIn. And a similar thing was like with my first child was due. My wife, 5 weeks early, she went into labor, and I was trying to finish up the game, and she came in and I was playing the game, and she says, I'm feeling these weird pains, and I said, well, have you called the doctor? And she said, oh, I'll call him right now. And so she calls him. She comes back to me like 15 minutes later, and she says, well, if I get doctor said if I get 10 more of these pains in the next hour to come to the hospital. And so I kind of looked up at the clock, and I was like going, yeah, I can finish this game in an hour. No problem, honey. I finished the game in an hour, and 6 hours later, my first son was born. So,
Oh, my goodness.
very similar to the story to yours.
That's incredible. And it's funny the way certain games stick with us attached to other memories like that. This sort of speaks on how powerful the medium is. But
Yeah, absolutely. I used to get emails from like the Midtown Madness from parents with disabled children that said, it's like my son can't play a game where he has to race a very fixed race. In Midtown Madness, we just had the Joyride feature where you could just drive anywhere you want and not have to race. And so stories like that was fantastic.
Oh yeah, how nice! What a nice bonus for you to hear something like that. That's incredible.
Yeah.
So in terms of people who would look for this book and sort of use this as a playbook, obviously for industry professionals and management level folks, it makes a ton of sense. I could see it used in college courses, no problem at all. I'm wondering, is there a size limit, or can indies benefit from this approach? What can you bring to the table for smaller teams like that?
Yeah, I interviewed a number of indie developers for the book. I was kind of an indie developer in the early '80s, making games and putting them in Ziploc bags for an Atari 8-bit computers. And really, just the focus on them is the lessons learned is just to focus on debt. While you're stuffing features into the game, focus on making them work and not letting the bugs and things pile up. That I've done a lot of work recently, the last several years, with new platforms like virtual reality and augmented reality with like Weta Workshop and Magic Leap and Oculus, and dealing with brand new platforms. How do you make a game for a platform that you can't even look at yet? That's not going. You're not even going to have prototypes for another year. How do you design for that? And saw some really interesting things happening down in Weta in New Zealand that they were trying out that we learned from. And I got a lot of feedback from the first edition from people outside the game industry, because it talks about how creative people and technical people get together. And my biggest client was Apple before Steve Jobs died, because his focus was on the overlap of the creative and the technical. And he was like Miyamoto. He just would come in and drop a bomb on me and say, I want it 3 weeks. And the development approach was for them at the time. Just everyone plays games, and so just connecting with stories and the story of how game development adopted an agile approach really connects with people outside the game industry, or anybody like film production, for example, that has a creative element. That can understand, because it's game development faced much bigger challenges than just IT development. Because with IT development, you might have a group of different programmers where one does the user interface and the other does the database. Working closely with them, I can see how they're struggling with the technology, or we can talk about the limits of technology, and they can understand that a little bit more. So the dynamic is a little bit different, but it applies to companies making underwater vehicles, where the mechanical engineer and the electrical engineer have to talk to this engineer and figure out how to best work together and discover when they don't speak each other's language so much.
Have you been close to any VR development in a large team situation? Because that's something I've kind of been curious about as this is starting to take off, and we've seen some big AAA and large budget VR projects take off. Have you seen that up close?
Not really, no. And I don't think it's, to me, it's like I finished playing Alex, which just blew me away on my Vive.
Yeah.
And it was really great to see, because it's starting to explore that vocabulary, which is unique in VR. But you can kind of see from their approach is the same thing where you're finding the fun at the start of the project. And in VR, what you're doing is you're starting with the basic vocabulary. The idea is at first you're developing the alphabet. what is the best way to move? What's the limitations of movement? And I've watched the videos that they've published on the development of Alex and exploring how they found what the limits are, what are the things that we can do to avoid frustration in VR, which, movement frustration is a big part of it, which I don't think a lot of developers, even with the small games, really focus on as much as they could. And just the scale of environments. Just like, hey, with VR, you can look around all over the place, and you could just put integrate these tremendous scenes of giant mechanical robots walking across skyscrapers and destroying parts of the skyscrapers while they're doing it.
Yeah.
And that's part of the vocabulary. Build that vocabulary up before you're ready to build sentences, build chapters on those paragraphs. That story, that same approach still works. Instead of trying to write a book without having a consistent vocabulary, is just build things up in the proper order. Deal with your risks and the uncertainties first, and then build upon those and exploit what you've learned about what's fun. And I think that just applies across anything. Like, really, the challenge is when you're building something for a uncertain platform or even uncertain market that hasn't revealed itself as kind of this moving target. That you kind of have to keep your options open, because a lot of times I see with new platforms coming out, which means that they have to get versions of the final well ahead of time. And some platforms, it can compromise the game and compromise the market.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of change, how is Agile methodology holding up to remote work and all of the things that we've sort of had to start doing since the pandemic started? Because I know a lot of studios have done some from home work. Some still aren't back in the office. So how does that communication element hold up when, everybody's working from home?
Yeah, I mean, there's a cost. We've been saying all along that, with teams, these cross-discipline teams, co-location is best. And one of the things that you have in an Agile approach is these metrics that can tell you that when you have a cross-discipline team that's co-located in the same area and they can just lean over and talk to each other, that things get done now. So we've kind of discovered that there's tools that we can use to kind of improve communication. But at the same time, that we've discovered, through just the pure metrics, that it is taking people longer to work remotely. But what you're going to see, I think, in the future is that there's going to be a hybrid of remote and on-site work, where we don't necessarily have to be in the office 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, to have the benefits of mixing it up, because there's also people report individual productivity has increased, where they can set their own hours, but the integrated work is suffering as a result. So I think from either an Agile point of view or just a traditional waterfall point of view, that this work from home has in many ways impacted. But one of the things that we've done, and I've switched from, I was 100% traveling to studios before this whole thing happened, and now I'm 100% remote work. So what we do with teams is, the core strength of agility is to have these regular, every 2 or 3 weeks, have these retrospectives where we discuss how can we improve our productivity? What have we done in the last 2 or 3 weeks that has either worked against it or improved it from the last time we had that retrospective? And come up with various things to try, these little experiments on how we could better work together based on what's gotten in our way. So I think it responds to traditional methods to change, and that's the whole point, because the pandemic has changed everything. But in game development or any IT development these days, it's like, hey, the phones are constantly changing, our computers are constantly changing, the market is constantly changing. So we have to keep up with change.
Yeah, something I've heard on social media often is, this might make the industry lean toward, being more accepting of remote work, because that's always the rally cry among those of us who don't live near industry hotspots, like myself being in St. Louis. I would have loved to work in the game industry fresh out of college, or really at any time since, But without relocating, it was never very realistic, unless it was just a very small studio full of people who did work 100% remote. But it sounds like, you say there may be a small shift, but it seems like for these reasons, the industry will probably still lean toward being physically located together.
Yeah, I think like I said, I think there'll be a hybrid where it's like, hey, you go in for, a couple days a week, so we can have more face-to-face, which, regardless of whether it's 40 hours a week or 10 hours a week, you kind of have to be near each other. But at the same time, it's like you look at it, it's like there's a bunch of game developers in the Bay Area. You look at the cost of living in the Bay Area, and let's say it's like, instead, you could work in St. Louis and telecommute in. St. Louis isn't as expensive in the Bay Area, and that cost differential might offset the loss of productivity. So I think we're still exploring that. We're still learning it. We a friend of mine and I, we published a book on remote teamwork tools. We just collected. We just asked people, what are you doing? What's working? What are some of the things you can do to help working at home? And and just things that we've learned over the last several months that has worked. And it could be just it could be simple things like, hey, when your kid bursts in the middle of a teleconference, introduce your kid. Don't get all upset about it and shush them out. So like, hey, you've brought your work into the home. Okay, and so you have to integrate with your home, and it's just don't worry about it. Everyone's dealing with it. But some of the tools that are coming out, I've been doing training and coaching in a virtual reality environment, and it holds a lot of promise for the way we're working in the future. Virtual reality hardware isn't quite there yet for doing it, but hey, with augmented reality, who knows? Where that's going in the future.
And that hits me close to home because my in-laws are visiting right now, or you would have absolutely met my son by now. Yeah, I mean, it's with the way things move so fast, I don't think we're done developing the remote work toolbox, and I'm sure people are going to start working on that more fervently than ever now, based on the need for it. But it kind of brings me back to how fast games in general move so quickly. And I mean, you just did the second edition of the book. I don't know how much time there was between the first and second, but I bet you'll have to work on the third pretty soon. Well, it's just the idea is just like books. I mean, the whole idea of publishing a big paper book, and it's been 10 years. Yeah, it's a part of it is it is really a slow cycle, and so I have a blog and everything else like that, and I share things with the blog, but coming out with a book is a lot like coming out with a game project. You have deadlines which really drive you, and big launches like a console game and stuff like that. And so I think it's this combination of just like connecting more with the audience on a day-to-day basis and publishing. It's like, hey, I learned this last week, or I ran into a developer that's okay with me sharing this technique that they use and pumping that out more frequently. But yeah, in terms of coming out with a book, the new edition, I think half of the new content, I just kind of went back and collected and reviewed the stuff I've been writing about over the last 10 years. But also had time to kind of sit down and kind of bring things together under a common framework in terms of, and this is what my GDC presentation is about, which is, how to create a culture. And the analogy is building up a culture which strengthens itself from stress, from failures. And the analogy is, it's like you go to the gym, you work out at the gym, and you're stressing your body out. You're actually damaging your body in a small way, but your body gets stronger as a result, and you become stronger. And there's an analogy to that in development studios, that instead of, it's like one example is, instead of putting bugs into a bug database, every time a bug comes up or a set of common bugs come up, look at the root cause. Look at the what is allowing these bugs to get into our game, and eliminating the root cause of how that's happening, so that
it doesn't happen in the future. Instead of just fixing a problem, go after and fix the root cause of it. And that's kind of the same thing as you're strengthening yourself through these little micro failures or these stressors that makes your organization stronger. So I go over 4 different areas where you can kind of make your studio culture stronger by going through these things and building up, addressing risk like I talked about, or building up the skill level and challenge at the developer level so that they're much more engaged with the work that they're doing, and they do much better work. They get, your organization gets stronger in that way.
Mm-hmm. Outstanding. I think that'll be a very interesting presentation, and I'm hoping that it'll be very well attended with the first remote GDC event coming up. You think that'll go well? Yeah,
I think so. I mean, people are getting a little burnt out of spending a lot of time online. With my courses is that I teach my courses online in virtual reality, but I break them up, and so instead of like 8-hour, you're not face to face, you can't do physical activities as much, and so I think we've learned those lessons with DTC and just kind of breaking things up and making it more accessible so that people can drop in and just attend the session they want to. This virtual reality company I'm working with, Verbella, they do things like that. They can hold these expos, and when you factor in, it's just like, hey, I can go to this session or that session, but I didn't have to jump on a plane. I didn't have to go to an expo hall and which is a mile away from my hotel. So I don't constantly walk around the expo hall.
You're kind of cutting out there.
And something like that. So I think the positive is it's like we don't have to book flights to San Francisco and find an expensive hotel and, just hang around all day. That's a benefit, even though, we don't get to go to the parties.
True. And I thought Apple's Worldwide Developer Conference online was actually pretty excellent. Like I got to watch that from the couch, hanging out with my son, and when something wasn't grabbing me, I just walked outside, did something else for a while, and came back. I loved it. I thought it was great. Yeah, I live in a neighborhood up in at 7,500 on the side of a mountain at 7,500 feet, and we've had I think it was like 10 to 15% of the houses have sold over the last year, and a lot of young professionals like employees from Google or Comcast have moved in, and they're working from home, and they do the same thing. It's just like, I'll get up, I'll do some work, then I'll take a hike in the mountains or swim in the lake, and then I'll come back and I'll do some work, and it's that kind of mixture of deciding what your life looks like on a day-to-day basis. They feel fully productive and happier. So it'll be an interesting new world at the end of this. I'm very curious to see what we take forward into the future with us from this whole experience, because it's really been wild. Go ahead and tell us sort of where we can find you online and what to grab, and plug anything you like, and I'll get you on your way. Okay. Well, the book, I have a website called agilegamedevelopment.com, and it just kind of has some initial things about the book. My website is Clinton Keith, Clinton like the president, EIT. And if, for GDC, just go to gdcconf.com. My session is called Taming the Chaos. Very nice. Well, we'll look forward to hearing that, and look forward to having you back next time and see what you've been up to again later. So thanks for doing this, and great to chat with you. You as well.
Congratulations on your game dev breakdown, whatever that is. Sounds idiotic to me.